So last week I disappeared for a few days. And, not because anything was wrong. Actually, for the first time in a very long time, everything felt right. I took my 10-year-old son camping, just the two of us. Well, that's not true. The two of us and Bruno, my big fat headed old bulldog that somehow believes he's in charge of everything. But I had every intention of filming while I was there. I packed up my cameras. I planned on getting beautiful shots of the lake, the campfire, the sunsets, some of the things we were going to do, and some drone footage, a little bit of everything. I was going to film the next video for this channel there, and actually one for the new channel as well. But something happened. I never even took the cameras out. Not once. And the reason I didn't has been on my mind ever since I got home. Because for 4 days, well, 5 days actually, I wasn't thinking about making content. I wasn't thinking about work. I wasn't thinking about tomorrow. I was just living. We didn't have any expensive camping gear with us. No fancy gadgets, no elaborate setup. Just a tent, a few basic supplies, some food, an axe, a saw, and a pile of firewood. I wanted my son to experience camping the way I grew up experiencing it. So, we cooked every single meal over a wood fire, breakfast, lunch, dinner, all of it. And we even made popcorn. Not Jiffy Pop, real popcorn. That, all that somehow tasted like a 5-star restaurant because we earned it. I showed him how to build a hobo stove out of things that we found around camp. Of course, we talked about fire safety. This is South Georgia and the whole world could burn down. The little bushcraft. And I taught him how to use what you have instead of always, buying something new. We fished, we swam, we laughed, we got dirty, very dirty. Bruno wandered around camp making sure no squirrel, got too comfortable, and an armadillo. But anyways, it wasn't an expensive vacation. It wasn't fancy. It just was what it was. But I honestly don't know if I've ever enjoyed 4 days more than I enjoyed those. One evening we were just sitting there. The sun was dropping behind the lake. That's the thumbnail picture, by the way. The water looked like glass. My son was off near the shoreline. Bruno was laying beside me, completely worn out from a hard day of supervising. And I remember just sitting there, doing absolutely nothing. No phone, no noise, no pressure, just watching the sunset. And then something hit me. Something that honestly caught me off guard. I don't think that I've ever felt peace like that in my entire adult life. Not once. And that realization stopped me dead in my tracks. Now before anybody misunderstands what I'm saying, yes, I've been happy before. I've laughed before. I've had great moments. I've gone on vacations. I've been camping. I've had birthdays, Christmases, family trips, good memories. But peace, real peace, that's different. Looking back, even during the good moments in my life, part of me was always on guard. You know, try to make sure everybody else is okay. Try to avoid the next argument. Trying to read the room. Trying to keep the peace instead of actually feeling it. I don't think I even knew what real peace felt like because chaos had become normal. When you've lived inside of chaos for long enough, you stop realizing that it's chaos. It just becomes life. You adapt, you survive. You convince yourself everyone lives that way. Until one day, You find yourself sitting beside a quiet lake and suddenly realize, no, this is what life is supposed to feel like. And here's something else that hit me. I had planned this trip for my son. I wanted him to experience real camping, to learn things that I grew up learning, how to cook over a fire, how to build something with his own hands, how to make a hobo stove, how to enjoy simple things. I thought I was teaching him, but somehow, well, somewhere along the way, I think he ended up reminding me that, that he reminded me of what life feels like when nobody's pretending. Nobody's rushing. Nobody's trying to impress anyone. Just a father, his son, and a loyal old dog. And enough time to actually enjoy being together. I realized those 4 days, they weren't about camping. You have to excuse me. The allergies they're killing me this year. But anyways, they were about presence. And I think that that's something that I've been rebuilding without even realizing it. One of the strangest parts is I wasn't checking my phone. I wasn't worried about analytics. I wasn't wondering how the last video was doing. I wasn't thinking about filming. In fact, I, consciously decided not to. Because for the first time, capturing the moment felt less important than living it. That's not something the old me would have done. The old me would have been trying to squeeze productivity out of every single second. This version of me just wanted to sit there and watch the sunset. When I left my marriage, I thought rebuilding meant replacing everything I'd lost. The house, the money, the business, hell, even the camping gear. But the life that I was supposed to have. But sitting beside that lake, I realized I wasn't rebuilding those things. I was rebuilding me. And somewhere along the way, without even noticing, I found something I've never really had before. Peace. Not because life is perfect, it isn't. And not because everything is easy, it isn't. Not because all of my problems disappeared, they haven't. But because I'm finally living a life where I don't have to be somebody else to keep it all together. I can just be me. And that might be the greatest guilt or gift that rebuilding has given me. As we packed up to leave, I found myself wishing, we had another day. And, not because we hadn't done enough already. To be honest, we were more tired than when we left. But because for those 4 days, life slowed down enough for me, I guess, to actually see it. And I realized something. Sometimes, the richest moments, I guess that's the right way of wording it. The richest moments in our life don't cost much money at all. Simple. A campfire, a fishing pole, a sunset, a 10-year-old little boy, and an old bulldog. And the kind of peace I spent my whole life searching for without realizing it wasn't a place I was looking for. It was a life. And I think I finally found it. I'll see y'all in the next one.